Greetings to you all. My name is Nduduzo Makhathini. I'm a pianist, healer, and improviser, and I'm speaking to you right now from South Africa. And earlier on today, I was thinking about like how the online format of gathering or communication has become quite central in our lives. Um, Although we've always had it as an option, but in this particular time period, it is at the center. And it just made me think about like how the things that we always see as being in the edges, as the human project evolves, they come almost towards the center. And this is really the spirit of how I want to share some of my thoughts with you today. uh, I'm particularly interested in how people come to sound. And of course, there are other aspects about the actual playing of the music, but I kind of feel like, it's important to think about what really brings us to sound. And I use this notion of the break as a way of trying to describe the way that I understand being an improviser. So I always feel like, in as much as we want to have this kind of entitlement to sound as something that we produce, as something that we make, as something that we compose, as something that we can manipulate. But I think there are aspects of sound that are constantly happening, in a sense that we bring ourselves to sound more than the other way. So in a sense, I want to suggest that in improvisation we break into something that is constantly happening, but it becomes a way of availing ourselves uh, for that particular revelation, as I call it, to sort of like emerge. What am I saying here? So I'm wanting to speak to you about improvisation as a way of getting inside the sound, as opposed to improvisation as a way of making the sound. So I obviously speak from a kind of like South African perspective, as I grew up here. And over many years, I've absorbed a lot of cultural concepts that I use as a kind of lens in order to understand both jazz and improvisation in a way that speaks to uh, a kind of familiar place, or like a familiar kind of hermeneutic, a lens that I understand. So there is a lot already that is in the sound that might help us in this conversation. In that way, I mean, already within the jazz vocabulary, there are so many words that we are so used to invoking in our speech, but we never really go deep enough to understand what they mean. So, for instance, I'll take the word changes, and how that is like part of really our language as jazz musicians, and we're constantly navigating changes. Uh, but we seldomly make connections between changes in society, changes in that are produced by evolution, and changes in the music that we play. So I'm kind of like moving towards an idea of the fact that music is produced by these changes. So the very same changes that we try to master within jazz are the changes that are already happening in our evolution as human beings. Um, so in a sense, this time period that is very complex uh, could be understood as um, a way of tapping into difficult changes or a way of navigating difficult changes. So in similar ways that like now, instead of being in the same room with you, I'm online. That is an example of how time and space forces us to rethink how we understand change, or it gives us an option of how we could work with the change. So that's really the idea that I'm putting forward when it comes to cultivating ways of coming to sound. So I use this notion of coming to sound because I believe that sounds are constantly there. And if anything, we are bringing ourselves to sound. Uh, Hence the notion of breaking into sound. But it is also true that as artists, we give ourselves this kind of entitlement that we are in essence producing the sounds, we are composing the sounds. So I'm wanting us to think about what it means to compose ourselves into the sounds, or what does it mean to play with the sounds and not play the sounds, but play with the sounds, or playing inside of the sounds. And so in trying to explain that, I want us to think about kind of like three modalities that we can consider as improvisers. One, I would like to explain the notion of the known. And secondly, I would like to explore the notion of the unknown. And lastly, I would like to explore the notion of the new knowing. And these three different stages are really at the core, at least in my understanding, of coming into terms with improvisation. So, and of course, like I said, I speak about these things inside a very specific cultural ideology. I speak about it in a very specific kind of like lens or hermeneutic window. And so, in terms of my cultural space, we believe that there is the living, which are visible. There is our ancestors, which are not visible, but that are parallel to us, and they are participating in what really adds up to be this life experience. So somehow at a cultural level, I understand the visible and the invisible to be collaborating. Similarly, I want to propose the idea of the known and the unknown to be constantly in a kind of dialogue or a call and response, which is something we use a lot as well in jazz in terms of the language. This idea of a call and response, but the call and response could be a call and response between the known and the unknown that produces these amazing sounds that we call improvisation or improvised music. So let's maybe take an example of, something that is like our kind of backbone inside the jazz kind of culture, which is standards. Uh, so over the years, these standards have become a way for us to figure out new things inside of these standards. Uh, so a lot of these standards have come from America, of course, and they also, a kind of acknowledging the people that brought this music, kind of the innovators. Like you would have to deal with Charlie Parker to understand the bebop period. You'll have to deal with Coltrane in order to understand the modal period. So somehow these standards are also a way of locating time. And while we locate time, we also locate the stories, we locate the histories that have produced this music. Now, in order to understand the three stages that I've explained, the first stage is understood as this like canon kind of idea, which is, as I call it, our backbone, the standards. And there's something interesting once again in the language of how we talk about standards. There's something that we call the theme. Sometimes we call it the head, which is quite a beautiful metaphor in terms of like, this is what gives sounds their identity, the face, so the melodies, right? And the melodies are located on the changes, right? So the theme or the melody or the head is kind of what I want to explore here as the known, right? And then the improvisation aspect that happens on top of the changes, that has an awareness of the known, which is the melody, which is the theme, which is the identity of a particular song. That part I want to locate under the realm of the unknown. Because somehow, even though we prepare for improvisation, but ultimately the beauty of our improvisation is in really not knowing. And then from that dimension, then I want to shift to the notion of a head out. Like when we play the theme, we improvise, and then we play the head out. So this head out, I want to call the new knowing. Why am I saying it's the new knowing? It's because when we play the theme and play the improvisation, which is unknown, we always have a different kind of understanding of what we knew before, which was the melody. So, in other words, when we come back to the theme after the solos, there's a new relationship with the theme, there's a new kind of knowing. And so, that is really at the core of what I want to discuss. And so, this part that I've just done is maybe what we could call our introduction. And now I want to move into part one that would discuss the known. So the known is really what we spend a lot of our time checking out, you know. The known is all the tools that we are forever in the practice room, kind of like making relationships with. So, like I say, we spend so many years learning different songs. And in these songs, as I propose their stories, in these jazz standards, there's a story of Duke Ellington that we are simultaneously learning as we are learning the music of Duke Ellington. So, in a sense, we could think about this particular phase as learning the stories. Learning the stories in a sense that these people that we are studying, or this kind of canon, is something that comes from the past. But also the storing, as in what is really stored inside of these songs. So the storing, as in a historical past, but also the storing, as in what did these great masters and great teachers actually store inside of these songs. Right. So what I want to get at is the fact that it's not only the melodies that we are learning, it's not only the changes that we are learning, it's not only the themes that we are learning, but we are also getting teachings. And these teachings have a lot to do with what these composers were going through, what they were seeing around them when these songs came up. And again, I want to suggest once more this notion of sounds as something that we compose ourselves into. So sound, or being an artist or being an improviser, as a way of being in the world. So in many ways, these melodies, these themes that we learn are not separate or do not operate outside of being or beingness or being in the world. So part of what maybe we would learn in jazz as like our basic kind of stories is the blues, right? And over many years, so many of the storing inside the blues has happened. We understand the blues as having emerged out of displacement, for instance. And this displacement was really about a cry, right? As we understand the transatlantic Atlantic narrative, the people that were taken as slaves and were removed from particular stories. And when they were removed from particular stories, they were simultaneously removed from geographies. They were removed from a particular way of being in the world. They were removed from the drums. They were removed from movement and dance. And so we could think of the blues as a product of displacement, but as a also a way of trying to sound out glimpses of what people could remember. So it's a way of restoring, bringing back the story, but also restoring, a particular culture, a particular heritage that happened in another space, in a particular time period. So that's really the one idea that we could explore around what is known. That what is known is ultimately not the melodies only, not the changes only, but this again breaking into. So which means that like the earlier blues players were thinking about displacement, were thinking about pain. There were so many considerations. And as a result of thinking about these things, they broke into sound. And particularly here in the continent, for instance, the elders, when like my grandmother used to speak about sound, she always uses this notion of breaking into. She would say, we're in this gathering and we're having a great time and we broke into song. So this is really the idea that like songs come about. Someone was thinking about something or someone was experiencing something and they broke into song. This therefore suggests that these songs are always there. And again, I'm bringing forth this idea of the ways in which we could compose ourselves into songs that are constantly happening. So in this way, I'm suggesting that in as much as we think we are composing music, but we are composing ourselves into circumstances, into sounds that are existing because of particular circumstances. And so in our considerations, as we sit in the practice block, as we try to learn all of this music, let's also be simultaneously thinking that we are learning these stories. We are learning the stories of the improvisers. So for the part that is known, I want to then suggest that the known is understanding a wholeness that surrounds the sound. So the wholeness meaning we understand the composers that produce this music, we understand the historical context under which these sounds were produced, and also we understand how the kinds of like relationships and the communal relationships that produce these sounds. As you would know that all of these sounds were produced inside particular movements. You know, we could think about like the shape of jazz to come. We could think about A Love Supreme. There were all these seminal recordings were produced within particular uh, or rather very specific time periods, and it was dealing with very often difficult circumstances. And similarly to here in South Africa, some of the seminal records like Yakalingomo, that was recorded in 78, I think, was coming right after the 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 Soweto uprising, which took place in 1976, and of course there was a lot of pain in those years. Similarly, we can locate sounds based on for instance, here in South Africa, the Black consciousness movement, but also the civil rights movement in the 60s in the United States. So I'm just trying to say, in considering the known, these standards, we also have to consider the histories that are part of understanding this backbone of this music, which is this canon, these standards. So that is really what I want to understand as the known. And now I would like to move to part two, or the second movement, which I call then the unknown.
Whoa, yeah. Whoa, phansi kwasengahoza mkhulu ukuthi samama zamkhuza ngithola umcimbi ngithola futhi ngithi umshado ngomthatha amashini wayish ashini usho umuntu ayiwele suka au
So this part is one of my greatest fascination, this idea of not knowing, as a way of coming to terms with improvisation and dealing with being in the world in real time. So there's always a sense of what we know within the unknown. So naturally, human beings want to hold on to that which is known, which I've just discussed, the past. So as improvisers, we find ourselves going back to the phrases. For instance, like in jazz, we find ourselves going back to the paka phrases as a way of coming to improvisation. But I'm proposing here the notion of the break, that from when we play the theme, we are gravitating towards the unknown. And I want to borrow here a notion of liminality. And liminality is an idea that is used by most writers that speak about rituals. And again, if we think about rituals, we see this kind of similar idea of, for instance, some of the traditional rituals here are rites of passage, in a sense that, like, you become a boy and then there's a transition from going from being a boy to becoming a man. And often there will be particular rituals that are practiced. And what's interesting for me is that when a ritual is practiced, the first thing that has to happen is you have to be moved or to be removed from a particular village or from a familiar kind of place. You have to be removed from, what do you call it? You have to be removed from things that you know. So normally people are taken to the wilderness. And the wilderness is a metaphor that I borrow in a lot of my work, being in the wilderness. And this notion of being an improviser is being in the wilderness where you are not familiar with surrounding, but you are trying to have relationships. You are listening to surrounding. And the notion of listening is quite central again when we talk about the unknown, this notion of sensing. But also, this notion of sensing is closely related to intuition. And this is at the core of being an improviser. It's about becoming intuitive, right? And when you are intuitive, it means you are constantly listening and you are collaborating with the environment, right? You are not seeing the environment as a backdrop under which you perform being, but you are constantly thinking about what are the relationships between space and being. So similarly, when you're improvising, you're listening to the ensemble. So the ensemble and the ensemble players become your fellow collaborators. But not only that, even the audience, but even the acoustics. There are studies that have been done on acoustemology that really deal with like behaviors inside spaces. So when you are an improviser and you are tapping into the unknown, you are in a sense in the wilderness. And in the wilderness, or we could even take it further and say in the desert. And part of the knowledge of the desert is to be able to kind of like have a sense for where the next move needs to go. But you do not have a preconceived idea because the desert is just like an open space. So it's difficult to know that I might find a bit of water there. I might find that there, or there might be another being coming from this direction. So not unless you are your intuition is cultivated, you are then unable to function in the desert. So I want us to really think about this notion of the desert as a way of coming into improvisation. In this sense, as I've said as well in ritual, that you are removed from the village where your father is, your mother is, you are removed to a kind of like wilderness. This is the same way that I'm proposing that when we improvise, even though we are familiar with particular vocabularies, sound fields, particular licks, particular ways of articulating changes, but I want to propose the idea of trying to move away from even those kind of like safe spaces, and again bringing this idea of vulnerability as the key into improvisation. And in a sense, we are saying uh, in improvisation, we have to allow ourselves to collaborate with vulnerability. We have to allow ourselves to be vulnerable. And this is part of what some of our greatest inspirations, people like John Coltrane, as we can see, from Giant Steps to A Love Supreme, and eventually to albums such as Kuluse Mama or Gunde or Living Space, we start to see Coltrane trying to move away from what he knew. So somehow it's a deeper level of understanding change, right? These changes, and you start thinking about what else exists, and that's why like we even see with people such as McCoy Tyner when they start like playing extensions. Or but what about Alice Coltrane, who came after the classic quartet, and they were really moving towards other paradigms with Rashid Ali and Jimmy Garrison remained in the group. But we can see how Coltrane, for instance, was moving away from the known, and he still had like themes that were very short. So the interest was in how do these themes become vortexes for bigger possibilities? How do we allow these themes to open up the depths of being an improviser? And that's really what I'm proposing here, that in a way, I realize even with myself that like when I practice, I am practicing everything that I know just so that it does not really occur during an improvisation. So practicing towards not doing the things that you are practicing. And this is really the idea, but it's not taken away from the known that we have discussed earlier. You have to know your standards, you have to know all the leaks, you have to know the changes, and you have to know how to navigate changes in order for you to drop all of these things into this realm of new possibilities. So this realm of improvisation can become very enjoyable if we enter in this kind of way. Uh, that you will still, when you listen back to the recordings, you still hear familiar things, but there are new relationships that are created every time you allow yourself to be vulnerable. And this is really the idea I'm wanting to put forward, to suggest that more than anything, the second phase is about dropping the first phase, right? It's about uh, making yourself available to new possibilities or to even new combinations of what you know. So, for instance, you could be playing a phrase, but you're only playing two notes of that particular phrase during an improvisation. But when you are practicing, you practice about 16 different notes that complete this particular phrase. So, in other words, improvisation then becomes about having renewed relationships with your vocabularies. So you are not reciting that which you are practicing, but you are exploring even the silences that live between what you practice. So it's a way of allowing ourselves to connect to something deeper, and that's often the spiritual paradigm. So it's a way of sounding out the silences, a way of making visible the invisible. So this notion that sounds are constantly there, but they are invisible, and that when we are on the bandstand, we are giving um, a sonic representation of something that in itself is silent. And now I want to move to the third phase, which is the new knowing. Again, to go back to the notion of liminality and ritual, like I said, the first stage is you are removed from the known, right? You are taken into the wilderness, an unfamiliar surrounding. And whenever you're done with that particular ritual, you have graduated, and now you are reincorporated into the village again, but now there is a new knowing of self. In the case that I made as an example earlier on of like the rituals, the rites of passage of becoming a man. So when you are extracted from a given village, you leave the village as a boy. But when you are in the wilderness and going through the ritual, there is a phase in the ritual where you are no longer a boy, but you are also not yet a man. So this is the kind of liminal space, this not knowing. And again, this is what I've just discussed in improvisation, this vulnerability, this lack of identity or concrete understanding of what is happening, and allowing yourself to be vulnerable in those moments. So now I'm discussing the last phase whereby whoever that left as a boy now has become a man, and they are being reincorporated into the village, and they are brought back, and now you are brought back as a man. And there are rituals as well of welcoming, of reincorporation. Now let's go back to the example I made earlier on about like how we understand the theme as the head, how we understand improvisation as the unknown. And we always in jazz go back to the theme. And now I'm putting forward this notion of the new knowing. So this is what we're discussing now, that having gone through this liminal space or having improvised, you are bound to understand the theme in a different way. And this is why it is always a beautiful thing to be a jazz musician, because no matter how many times you play something, but it's always going to be different. And the argument that I'm making here is what makes it different is our getting lost in the wilderness. That getting lost, that liminality is really what creates new forms or renewed relationships with sound always. And these renewed relationships with sound is really at the core of being an improviser. That you go all the way to try and improvise and come back with a kind of new understanding of both the improvisation, which is the unknown, but once it's performed, it becomes the known automatically, but also that of what lived before you went into that stage. So somehow, my idea is that what has really made this music to evolve over the years is the idea, the middle stage of improvisation that gives us new relationships with the sound when we play the head out. But the head out could be also understood as this post notion, right? Like, for instance, if we look at what's happening globally now in this corona time period, whenever this stage is gone, we would always have a relationship with online that we've never had before. So online always existed, but now that it has become at the center of our communication, we would move towards a kind of hybrid way of being in the world, where we'll continue to use online and also use other methods that are outside technology. So in a sense, we could borrow our understanding of the three stages that I've just explained now as a metaphor for seeing life. And in essence, how we play the music is always not only a reflection of what's happening in our lives, but also as a way of confronting our lives, as a way of producing solutions. And if we start really having this kind of relationship with improvisation, I believe that in that way we are creating also new relationships with the sound, and if we understand the post as being important for when we come back to the known again, then we'll believe in the concepts that I want to explore just briefly, that I feel they really inform being an improviser or being an artist. And that is the notion of wholeness and the notion of continuity. And this would constitute some of my closing thoughts. So as I close, I'm again really thankful that you have taken the time and listened to this masterclass. So I want to just leave you with this idea of being an improviser or being a jazz artist as a way of restoring wholeness. So when I speak about wholeness, is that you understand both silence and you understand the sound. So in a way, you do not see these as opposites, but you see them as collaborators. Similarly, you understand the invisible, the world of the spirit, and the world of the living as being in a collaboration as well. So then continuity then informs how we move around wholeness. So similarly, the Earth orbiting around the sun, it's a similar thing that I want to suggest that so sound is our sun and we are constantly rotating around the sun. So in order for us to really stay inspired, we have to always restore this wholeness that understands the totality of things, the totality of being in the world, that we understand equally the known, we understand the unknown, and we understand the new knowing. And we keep the sound as this kind of continuity of renewing relationships between the known and the unknown. And those are really the words that I want to leave behind. And thank you so much once again for listening. Togoza Ashe.